Your brain was never designed to read. At first, that sounds wrong. Reading feels natural. You look at words, and meaning appears almost instantly. You don't think about the shapes of the letters. You don't consciously decode each sound. And you certainly don't feel like you're performing a complex mental task. It feels simple, almost automatic, like something your brain was always meant to do. But that feeling is misleading, because if you go back far enough in human history, you find something surprising. For most of our existence, reading did not exist at all. There were no alphabets, no books, no written language. Humans lived, communicated, survived, and built entire societies without ever seeing a written word. The brain you are using right now, the same basic structure evolved in that world. It evolved to recognize faces instantly, to detect patterns in nature, to understand spoken language, to react quickly to danger, and to navigate complex social interactions. These abilities were essential for survival. They were shaped over hundreds of thousands of years. But reading is only a few thousand years old. From an evolutionary perspective, that's nothing. It's too short a time for the brain to develop specialized structures just for reading. There hasn't been enough time for natural selection to build a reading center into the human brain. And yet, here you are, reading effortlessly. So something unusual must be happening. Instead of evolving a new system specifically for reading, the brain does something more clever. It takes existing systems, ones built for entirely different purposes, and repurposes them. It reuses them. When you look at a word, your brain does not see meaning directly. It first sees shapes, lines, curves, patterns of contrast. These are processed by visual systems that originally evolved to recognize objects and faces. Then almost immediately, those shapes are linked to sounds, using parts of the brain designed for spoken language. And then those sounds are connected to meaning, drawing on memory, experience, and context. This entire chain of events happens so quickly that you never notice it. It feels like you are simply reading. But in reality, your brain is performing a complex transformation, turning visual patterns into language and language into meaning. And here's the strange part. None of the systems involved were originally meant for this task. It's like using a tool in a way it was never designed for. Imagine using a camera as a mirror or a microphone as a sensor. It works, but only because you're forcing it to adapt. Reading is exactly that kind of adaptation. It is not a natural instinct. It is a learned skill built on top of older, more fundamental abilities. And once you see this, something subtle begins to shift, because what feels obvious, what feels natural, is often just something your brain has learned to do so well that it hides its own complexity. Reading feels effortless not because it is simple, but because your brain has spent years reshaping itself to make it feel that way. So if the brain was never designed to read, how does it actually manage to do it so smoothly? The answer is not that the brain developed a new system. It's that it learned how to reuse the systems it already had. Think about what your brain is naturally good at. It can recognize objects instantly. It can tell the difference between a face and a background in a fraction of a second. It can process spoken language, picking out words from a continuous stream of sound. It can connect sounds to meaning without any conscious effort. These abilities were not built for reading, but they are exactly what reading needs. So instead of building something new, the brain takes these existing abilities and links them together in a very precise way. When your eyes land on a word, the first thing your brain does is treat it like an object. It sees shapes, lines, edges, curves. At this stage, there is no meaning, no language, just visual information. This part of the process is handled by regions that evolved long before writing existed, regions that were originally used to recognize things like tools, animals, and faces. Then something interesting happens. Those shapes are quickly mapped onto sounds. Even if you are reading silently, your brain is activating systems related to speech. It's as if your brain is quietly hearing the word inside your head. This connection between visual symbols and sound is not automatic. You had to learn it. As a child, you were taught that certain shapes correspond to certain sounds, and over time, this association became stronger and faster. But the process doesn't stop there. Once the brain has linked shapes to sounds, It moves one step further and connects those sounds to meaning. This involves memory, experience, and context. The word you are reading triggers associations, images, ideas, emotions that give it significance. All of this happens in a fraction of a second. So what feels like a simple act, just reading a word, is actually a chain of transformations. Visual pattern, gaze, sound, key meaning. And the remarkable thing is that this chain was never pre-built. It had to be constructed through learning. This is why reading is not automatic for everyone. A person who has never learned to read does not see words the way you do. To them, a page of text is just a collection of shapes. The visual information is the same, but the interpretation is completely different. This tells us something very important. The meaning is not in the words themselves. It is created by the brain. Without the learned connections between shapes, sounds, and meaning, the text is empty. It carries no message on its own. It only becomes meaningful when a brain knows how to decode it, and even then, the process is not perfect. Because the brain is reusing systems that were designed for other purposes, reading can be sensitive to small changes. If letters are arranged in unfamiliar ways, or if the structure of a sentence is too complex, comprehension slows down. The system starts to struggle because it is being pushed beyond the patterns it has learned. This reveals something subtle but important. Reading feels natural, but it is actually a carefully trained coordination between different parts of the brain. It works smoothly only because those parts have been tuned over time to cooperate in a very specific way. In other words, reading is not something your brain was built to do. It is something your brain learned to simulate so well that it now feels effortless. If you look closely at what happens when you read, one of the most surprising realizations is this: the meaning you experience is not actually inside the words. It feels like it is. When you read a sentence, it seems as if the meaning is sitting there on the page, waiting to be picked up, almost like an object you can hold. But that impression is an illusion created by how efficiently your brain works. The symbols on the page, letters, words, sentences, are just patterns. They are arrangements of shapes with no inherent meaning. Ink on paper, pixels on a screen. By themselves, they don't contain ideas, emotions, or understanding. To see this more clearly, imagine a person who has never learned to read. Not someone who forgot, but someone who was never exposed to written language at all. If you show them a page filled with text, they will see exactly what you see in terms of light and shape. The same letters, the same spacing, the same structure. But for them, there is no meaning. There are no words, no sentences, no story, only visual patterns. This tells us something fundamental. The meaning is not in the text. It is something that emerges only when a trained brain interacts with those symbols. Reading, then, is not the extraction of meaning. It is the construction of meaning. When your eyes move across a sentence, your brain is actively building an internal interpretation. It takes each word, connects it to sounds, links it to memories and associations, and assembles all of that into a coherent idea. This process happens so quickly and seamlessly that it feels like the meaning is already there, but in reality, your brain is generating it in real time. You can notice this if you encounter a sentence that is ambiguous or confusing. Sometimes you have to read it twice. The words haven't changed, but your interpretation does. On the first pass, the brain may construct one meaning. On the second pass, it revises that construction and produces a different understanding. The text remains constant. The meaning shifts. This wouldn't be possible if meaning were truly contained in the words themselves. Another way to see this is through language differences. A sentence written in a language you don't understand carries no meaning for you, even though it may be full of meaning for someone else. Again, the symbols are the same, but the brain interpreting them is different. So where does meaning exist? It doesn't exist purely in the external world because the symbols alone are not enough, and it doesn't exist purely in the brain because without the external trigger, the text, there is nothing to interpret in that specific way. Meaning exists in the interaction between the two. It is something that happens, not something that simply is, and this has a deeper implication. When you read, you are not passively receiving information. You are participating in a process. You are taking incomplete signals, shapes on a page, and turning them into something rich and structured inside your mind. In other words, you are not discovering meaning. You are creating it. This doesn't make reading less real. It makes it more interesting. It shows that what feels immediate and obvious is actually the result of a hidden process, one that depends entirely on how your brain has been shaped by learning and experience. And once you recognize this, it becomes harder to ignore a larger question. If meaning in reading is constructed rather than given, then how much of what you experience in the world works the same way? When you first learn to read, it doesn't feel natural at all. It feels slow, effortful, and sometimes frustrating. You have to focus on each letter, sound out each word, and hold pieces of information in your mind while trying to make sense of them. There is nothing automatic about it in the beginning. Every step requires attention, but something gradual and remarkable starts to happen. With practice, the brain begins to reorganize itself. Connections between different regions strengthen. Visual areas that once responded to general objects begin to respond more specifically to letters and words. Language areas become more tightly linked with what you see. The brain starts building a fast and efficient pathway that connects shapes directly to meaning. This change is not just functional, it is physical. Neurons that fire together repeatedly begin to wire together more strongly. Pathways that are used often become faster and more reliable. Over time, the brain essentially carves out a specialized route for reading, even though no such route existed before. You can think of it like a path forming in a field. At first, there is no clear way through. Walking across it is slow and uncertain. But the more times you walk the same route, the more defined the path becomes. Eventually, it becomes easy to follow, almost automatic. Reading works the same way. What was once effortful becomes smooth, not because the task has changed, but because the brain has changed. This is why skilled readers no longer notice the individual steps. They don't consciously see letters, convert them to sounds, and then assemble meaning. The entire process collapses into a single experience. You look at a word and meaning appears instantly, as if it were always there. But that smoothness hides the complexity underneath. It creates the illusion that reading is natural. In reality, it is the result of repeated training that has reshaped the brain over time. This also explains why learning to read can be difficult for some people. Since the brain was not originally designed for this task, it doesn't come pre-configured for everyone in the same way. Small differences in how the brain processes visual patterns or language can make the process easier or harder. In some cases, the connections between visual and language systems don't form as efficiently. This can lead to difficulties in recognizing words quickly or linking them to sounds and meaning. The underlying systems are still there, but the coordination between them is less smooth. This highlights something important. Reading is not a single ability. It is a coordination of multiple abilities working together. If one part of the system struggles, the entire process can be affected. And yet, when it works well, it feels effortless. That contrast between the complexity of the process and the simplicity of the experience is what makes reading so fascinating. It is a learned skill that becomes so deeply integrated into the brain that it feels like an instinct. But it is not an instinct. It is a transformation. The brain you are using to read now is not the same as the one you had before you learned. It has been reshaped by experience, reorganized to perform a task it was never originally meant to do. And once that transformation happens, it becomes almost invisible. You don't notice the changes. You only notice the result. A page of symbols becomes a world of meaning. And it happens so seamlessly that it feels like it was always meant to be that way. Reading feels effortless when you are skilled at it, but that feeling hides how delicate the process actually is. Underneath the surface, reading is a coordinated sequence of operations that must happen in the right order and at the right speed. If even a small part of that sequence is disrupted, the entire experience begins to break down. To see this, consider how your eyes move across a line of text. They don't glide smoothly from left to right. Instead, they jump in small, rapid movements called saccades, pausing briefly to capture information before jumping again. During each pause, your brain gathers visual data, processes it, and begins constructing meaning. This happens so quickly that it feels continuous, but in reality it is a series of discrete steps. At the same time, your brain is holding pieces of the sentence in memory. As you move from one word to the next, you must retain what you've just read long enough to connect it with what comes next. This requires working memory, a system that is limited and easily overloaded. If a sentence is too long or too complex, that system struggles and comprehension starts to fade. Now imagine introducing a small disruption. Change the order of letters in a word slightly or replace familiar words with unfamiliar ones. Suddenly, the smooth flow of reading slows down. You may need to stop, go back, and reread. The process that felt automatic begins to reveal its underlying effort. This fragility shows something important. Reading is not a built-in function like vision or hearing. It is a constructed skill that depends on precise coordination. When everything aligns, it feels effortless. But when something shifts, even slightly, the system struggles to maintain that illusion of ease. There's another layer to this. Your brain is constantly predicting what comes next. As you read, it doesn't wait for each word to arrive fully formed. It anticipates likely words and meanings based on context. This prediction speeds up the process, allowing you to move quickly through text. But it also means that reading is not purely about decoding what is there. It is also about guessing what should be there. This is why you can sometimes read a sentence and miss an error entirely. Your brain fills in what it expects rather than what is actually written. The prediction overrides the input. In this sense, reading is not just fragile, it is biased. It depends on expectations, prior knowledge, and context. The meaning you extract is shaped not only by the text, but by what your brain is prepared to see. This reveals something subtle but important. The feeling of fluency in reading is not proof of accuracy. It is a signal that the system is running smoothly, but smooth operation does not guarantee correct interpretation. You can read something quickly and feel like you understand it, while actually missing key details. The brain prioritizes efficiency, not perfection. All of this points to a deeper insight. Reading is not a passive process where information flows cleanly from page to mind. It is an active construction, supported by fragile systems, guided by predictions, and shaped by limitations. It works remarkably well most of the time, which is why it feels invisible. But the moment you examine it closely or disrupt it slightly, the complexity becomes clear. What appears simple is actually a finely balanced system, constantly working to maintain the illusion that reading is easy. When you read, it feels as though you are directly accessing ideas, as if meaning is flowing from the page into your mind. But if you slow the process down and examine it carefully, something very different is happening. You are not receiving meaning. You are generating it. Words are not containers that hold ideas inside them. They are triggers. When your eyes detect a word, your brain uses it as a signal to activate patterns, memories, associations, sensory fragments that together create the experience of meaning. Take a simple word like forest. The letters themselves are just shapes, but the moment you read it, something happens inside your mind. You might imagine trees, shadows, the smell of soil, the sound of wind moving through leaves. None of these things are in the word itself. They come from you. Someone else might read the same word and imagine something completely different. A dense jungle, a quiet park, or even a scene from a movie. The external stimulus is identical, but the internal experience varies. This shows that reading is not a transfer of meaning. It is a reconstruction. The brain takes minimal input, just a few symbols, and expands it into a rich internal simulation. It fills in details that are not explicitly present. It connects the word to past experiences, emotions, and knowledge, creating something that feels complete. In this sense, reading is closer to imagining than it is to observing. You are not just decoding information. You are building a world inside your mind guided by the structure of language. This becomes even clearer when you read something descriptive. A well-written passage can make you feel as though you are seeing, hearing, or even physically experiencing something. But nothing has actually changed in the external world. The page remains static. The environment around you remains the same. The entire experience is being generated internally. And yet it feels real. This raises an interesting question. If your brain can create such vivid experiences from simple symbols, how do you distinguish between what is coming from the outside and what is being constructed inside? In everyday life, we assume that perception is a direct window into reality. We see something and we believe we are experiencing it as it truly is. But reading reveals that the brain is capable of constructing detailed experiences from very limited input. It suggests that perception may always involve a degree of construction. Even when you are not reading, your brain is interpreting signals, filling in gaps, and creating a coherent picture of the world. The difference is that in reading, this process becomes more obvious because the input is so minimal. A few shapes on a page lead to a complex internal experience. That transformation is not happening in the text, it is happening in you. And once you notice this, it becomes difficult to ignore the possibility that much of what you experience as reality is shaped in a similar way. Not invented out of nothing, but constructed from signals, interpreted through prior knowledge, and assembled into a meaningful whole. Reading is a clear example of this process because it is so artificial. The brain was never meant to do it, yet it adapts and performs the task remarkably well. But the deeper insight is not about reading itself. It is about how the brain creates meaning from the world. Words are just the trigger. The experience is the result. Once you begin to see reading as a process of construction rather than simple recognition, it becomes clear that the brain is not passively receiving information. It is constantly interpreting, predicting, and shaping what it experiences. When you read a sentence, your brain does not wait for each word to arrive and then process it in isolation. It actively anticipates what is likely to come next. Based on grammar, context, and past experience, it forms expectations before the next word even appears. This predictive process is what makes reading fast. Instead of building meaning from scratch every time, the brain uses shortcuts. It fills in gaps, skips over predictable words, and focuses on the parts that carry new information. This is why you can read quickly without consciously noticing every letter. Your brain is not carefully analyzing everything. It is making educated guesses and correcting them when necessary. But this efficiency comes at a cost. Because the brain relies on prediction, it is also prone to error. It can see what it expects to see rather than what is actually there. This is why you can read a sentence with a missing or repeated word and not notice the mistake. The brain fills in the correct version automatically, creating the illusion that the text was accurate all along. In this sense, reading is not just about perception. It is about expectation. What you understand depends not only on what is written, but on what your brain is prepared to interpret. Two people with different backgrounds, knowledge, or assumptions can read the same text and come away with different meanings. The words are identical, but the internal construction is different. This shows that meaning is not fixed. It is shaped by the reader. And this idea extends beyond reading. The same predictive mechanisms are at work in everyday perception. When you look at the world, your brain is not simply recording what is there. It is interpreting sensory input based on prior knowledge and expectations. It fills in missing information, smooths over inconsistencies, and creates a stable picture of reality. Reading makes this process visible. Because the input is so limited, just symbols on a page, the role of the brain becomes more obvious. You can see how much work it is doing to turn those symbols into something meaningful. But in normal perception, the input is richer and the construction process is hidden. This leads to a deeper realization. The clarity and stability of your experience are not proof that you are seeing reality exactly as it is. They are evidence that your brain is very good at creating a coherent interpretation. Reading is a kind of controlled example of this process. It shows how the brain can take minimal input and generate a complete experience. It also shows how that experience can be influenced by expectation, context, and prior knowledge. What feels immediate and obvious is actually the result of complex internal processing. And once you recognize this, it becomes harder to treat perception as something simple or direct. Instead, it begins to look like a carefully constructed model one that works well enough for us to navigate the world, but may not fully capture the underlying reality. Reading does not just reveal how we understand words. It reveals how we understand everything. As reading reveals, your experience of meaning is never just a direct reflection of the world. It is always shaped by your brain's internal construction. The words on a page are fixed and unchanging, but the meaning that emerges from them is not. It depends entirely on your prior knowledge, your expectations, and the associations your brain brings to the text. In other words, reading is a dynamic interaction, not a passive reception. Consider how different readers can interpret the same sentence in completely different ways. A simple line of poetry might evoke vivid imagery for one person while leaving another reader indifferent or confused. The symbols themselves haven't changed. What has changed is the internal context each reader brings to them. The brain interprets symbols through the lens of experience, memory, and culture, constructing a unique experience for each individual. Meaning is not in the text, it is in the interplay between brain and symbol. This is why learning to read transforms perception. Before a child learns to decode symbols, a page is just a collection of shapes, lines, and curves. After learning, those same shapes can trigger entire worlds of thought and imagination. The text itself has not changed, but the reader's brain has acquired the ability to create rich internal simulations from it. Learning to read rewires the brain, strengthening connections between visual, linguistic, and memory systems, creating pathways that allow symbols to trigger complex meaning almost instantaneously. Because reading is artificial in the sense that it repurposes older brain systems, it is also inherently limited. It is slower and more fragile than the perception of natural stimuli like faces or spoken words. It can be disrupted easily by unfamiliar fonts, poor spacing, or distorted letters. The process depends on coordination across multiple brain systems, and any disruption in that coordination slows or breaks comprehension. Yet when the system works, it is astonishingly efficient, giving the illusion of direct access to meaning, while in reality engaging in complex reconstruction. This reconstruction is active, not passive. Even when reading silently, the brain simulates auditory patterns. It converts symbols to sounds internally, even if no one else hears them. Then it links these sounds to meanings, memories, emotions, and concepts. Reading is, in effect, a simulation engine in your mind, turning minimal visual input into a rich, multi-dimensional experience. Understanding this sheds light on something deeper. Our perception of reality may function in the same way. Just as a few symbols can trigger entire internal experiences, sensory inputs from the world are interpreted by the brain, filled with assumptions, predictions, and context. Reading is an especially clear example because the input is artificial and abstract, making the construction process more obvious. In everyday life, the same mechanisms are at work, but the richness of sensory data hides the complexity. The brain's internal models make reality appear seamless and immediate, masking the fact that it is an active interpretation rather than a simple recording of the world. Reading also shows the role of expectation in shaping experience. The brain constantly anticipates what comes next, using context and past knowledge to predict meaning. When expectations match the input, comprehension is smooth and rapid. When they conflict, the brain must adjust, slowing the process. This predictive function is central not only to reading, but to all perception and understanding. Ultimately, reading illustrates a profound truth: the world, as you experience it, is not independent of your brain. Reality is mediated, interpreted, and constructed by neural processes. Symbols do not hold meaning. They serve as triggers for internal construction. Your brain does not passively receive information, it actively generates it. Through reading, we see clearly that what we perceive, understand, and imagine is a product of the interaction between external stimuli and the intricate machinery of the mind. If reading reveals how the brain constructs meaning from minimal input, it also shows us how much our perception of the world is shaped by the mind itself. When you read a word or a sentence, the letters on the page do not contain the idea. Instead, your brain takes those shapes, maps them to sounds, links them to prior knowledge and memory, and generates an experience. Meaning does not exist in the external world independently. It exists in the interaction between the symbols and your brain. This process is active, not passive. You are not a mere recipient of information. You are an interpreter constantly filling in gaps, anticipating what comes next, and shaping what you experience. The brain is always predicting, using context and prior knowledge to make sense of incoming stimuli. In reading, this becomes highly visible. If a word is familiar or the sentence is predictable, comprehension flows almost effortlessly. If a word is unfamiliar or the text is ambiguous, the brain has to work harder to reconstruct meaning. This shows that reading is not simply recognition, it is reconstruction. Your experience of a text depends on what you already know, the associations your brain has formed, and the internal simulations it generates. Two people can read the same line and have entirely different mental images, emotions, or interpretations. The text itself has not changed, but the meaning that emerges is different because the brain constructing it is different. The same principle applies to reality in general. Reading makes the process of interpretation obvious because the input, symbols on a page, is abstract and artificial. But in everyday perception, the brain is performing similar work. Sensory information from the world is interpreted, predicted, and integrated into a coherent model. You do not directly perceive reality as it exists independently. You perceive a model constructed by your brain which fills in gaps, anticipates patterns, and corrects inconsistencies to create the seamless experience you take for granted. In reading, the brain's predictive power is particularly clear. It anticipates words' meanings and structures, often correcting errors automatically. You might skim a line and overlook typos, or your mind might fill in a missing word without noticing. This shows that comprehension is not purely passive reception, but an active reconstruction guided by expectations. The brain is not simply decoding symbols, it is creating experience, simulating meaning, and filling in gaps. The implications of this are profound. Reading demonstrates that what you perceive, understand, and imagine is never just in the external world. It emerges from the interaction between the external signal and the brain's internal machinery. Reality, as you experience it, is shaped by your mind. Reading is a controlled example, a simplified version that makes this invisible process visible. Furthermore, this reconstruction is fragile. Disrupt the text with unfamiliar words, strange fonts, or scrambled letters, and comprehension falters. This fragility highlights how much of reading relies on learned connections and expectations. The smoothness you feel when reading is an illusion created by training, practice, and neural adaptation. The effortless experience masks the intricate coordination of visual, auditory, linguistic, and memory systems working together. Ultimately, reading teaches a larger lesson. The world as you perceive it is not simply given. It is constructed by your brain based on signals it receives and the prior knowledge it carries. Meaning is not fixed in symbols, objects, or sensory inputs. It is generated internally in response to external cues. Reading is a window into this construction process, showing us that your mind does not just receive reality, it creates it. If reading demonstrates how the brain constructs meaning from minimal signals, it also highlights the gap between the physical processes of the brain and the subjective experience of understanding. When you read, a cascade of neural activity occurs. Shapes are detected by the visual system, mapped onto sounds, linked to memory, and connected to abstract concepts. Neurons fire, signals travel, and patterns form. All of this is measurable. Scientists can track which regions of the brain are active, see how signals propagate, and observe how learning changes connectivity. Yet none of this explains the experience of meaning itself. At what point does a pattern of neural activity become the understanding of a sentence? At what point does the firing of neurons transform into an idea that feels alive in your mind? This question illustrates a fundamental tension between objective observation and subjective experience. The mechanics of reading can be described and measured, but the inner experience, the awareness of comprehension, remains mysterious. Reading makes this mystery obvious. It is an artificial activity, one that the brain had to repurpose its existing structures to perform. Yet despite its artificiality, reading creates a compelling experience of direct access to ideas. You feel as if the words are transmitting meaning to your mind. But in truth, the brain is actively constructing that meaning. The text itself is inert, and your experience is generated internally. This reconstruction reveals the active role of the reader in producing reality. Words are not vessels carrying fixed ideas. They are cues that trigger internal processes. Your brain interprets, predicts, simulates, and fills in missing information. The smoothness and immediacy of reading hide this complex orchestration, creating the illusion of passive reception. But when comprehension falters, when a sentence confuses you or a word is unfamiliar, the underlying machinery becomes visible. The effort of reconstruction becomes apparent, showing that understanding is not automatic but achieved. The predictive nature of the brain plays a critical role. While reading, your brain continuously anticipates what comes next, forming expectations based on grammar, syntax, context, and prior experience. This is why reading fluently is possible. Your mind does not wait for each word to appear and build meaning sequentially. It guesses, simulates, and adjusts in real time. These predictions allow you to process text far faster than if the brain were decoding each letter and word in isolation. This efficiency is remarkable, but it is also imperfect. Because the brain relies on prior knowledge and expectation, it is prone to misinterpretation. You can read a sentence quickly and feel as though you understand it completely, even while overlooking subtle errors or nuances. Two readers can interpret the same sentence differently, shaped by their experiences, biases, and context. The text is constant, but the experience is unique to each individual. Reading also illustrates the active creation of internal experience from minimal external input. The symbols on the page provide only the barest cues, yet your brain generates imagery, associations, emotions, and abstract understanding. The complexity of the experience vastly exceeds the simplicity of the stimulus. It is a striking demonstration of how much of what you perceive as reality is constructed internally rather than delivered directly from the outside world. This realization has far-reaching implications. Reading is a concentrated example of a more general principle. Perception itself is an active, interpretive process. Just as words are transformed into meaning by the brain, sensory signals are transformed into experience. Your perception of reality is not a passive reflection of the external world. It is a model created by your mind, shaped by prior knowledge, expectation, and neural architecture. Ultimately, reading exposes the fundamental nature of understanding. The world as you experience it is inseparable from the brain that interprets it. Meaning is not simply out there, waiting to be discovered. It is generated internally in response to cues, symbols, and signals. Words are triggers, comprehension is creation. Through reading, we see clearly that understanding is not a window onto a fixed reality, it is a dynamic construction inside the mind.